The Midwest, where the corn grows tall, the winters are brutal, and sometimes the guys running the local trucking company know a little more about business than they should. For decades, from Chicago to Milwaukee to Kansas City and Omaha, certain gentlemen in nice suits handled problems quietly, very quietly. And now, you can bring that same heartland problem-solving tradition into your own home. Introducing the Midwest Mob Problem Solver Kit, the only household product inspired by the legendary operations of the American Midwest. Inside every box you'll receive the Union Hall negotiation table, perfect for discussing contracts, debts, or who exactly forgot to pay their gambling tab. The Cornfield Privacy Guarantee, because sometimes certain conversations require a very quiet location. The Teamster's Timekeeper Stopwatch, used to measure exactly how long it takes someone to suddenly remember the truth. And of course, the Midwest Ledger of Favors, because around here, nobody forgets who owes who. But wait, there's more. Order today and we'll include the Emergency Alibi Generator, Midwest Edition. Spin the dial and instantly receive classic excuses like, I was at the bowling league. I was helping my cousin move snow. I was at the church fish fry. Or the Midwest classic, I don't know nothing about that. Thousands of satisfied customers from Chicago to Kansas City agree. Sometimes problems don't require lawyers. Sometimes they just require the Midwest Mob Problem Solver Kit. Available now. Exclusively from Pizzaverse Studios and Palermo Productions. Because when things get complicated, the Midwest has always had a way of keeping things nice and quiet.
Pizzaverse strong, motherfucker strong.
Andy Palermo, running around Pizzaverse. Fuck you and Pizzaverse.
Wendy Barrie, Hollywood, Bugsy, and the Price of Glamour. A Pizzaverse Studios documentary. A Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent D'Iprio. Hollywood sells a lie better than anybody. It sells beauty, it sells class, it sells dreams wrapped in silk and spotlight. But behind the velvet curtains and polished red carpets, the foundation of that empire was often built the old-fashioned way, with fear, corruption, and blood. On screen, Wendy Barrie was the embodiment of aristocratic grace, a British rose, refined, elegant, untouchable. She looked like the kind of woman who belonged in drawing rooms, royal courts, and candlelit manors, not in the orbit of gangsters. But off-screen, that image became a weapon. Because behind the camera stood Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, not a gentleman, not a studio prince, not some glamorous rogue Hollywood later tried to turn into legend. He was a killer, a man forged in the gutter, a founding syndicate butcher who climbed out of Brooklyn with murder in one hand and ambition in the other. He didn't want autographs, he wanted access. He didn't want admiration, he wanted legitimacy. And in Wendy Barrie, he found the perfect passport. Some accounts suggest that when studio moguls became too afraid to confront the underworld, they allowed one of their most elegant stars to become a shield. Not because they loved her, not because they valued her, but because keeping a volatile gangster satisfied was good for business. And once she was no longer useful, they let her fall. So how does a woman born into privilege and polished by the old world end up trapped beside one of America's most notorious gangsters? Why did Hollywood protect the predator instead of the star? And why did the machine that made Wendy Barrie famous work so hard to erase what happened to her? This is not just a story about romance gone wrong. This is a story about image laundering, about cowardice in expensive suits, about the mafia's infiltration of Hollywood, and about a woman who survived the glamour, the scandal, and the betrayal of a system that treated human beings like inventory. Because the architect of Wendy Barrie's downfall didn't carry a script. He carried a gun. The woman Hollywood bought. Hollywood did not merely hire Wendy Barrie. It bought a brand. She was born Marguerite Wendy Jenkins in Hong Kong, the daughter of a wealthy English lawyer, and she was raised inside the rigid architecture of British colonial privilege. Her early life was shaped by rules, posture, etiquette, discipline, England, Switzerland, convent schools, finishing schools, the whole polished package. She was taught how to walk, how to speak, how to pour tea, how to suppress emotion, how to become acceptable to elite society. She was groomed to marry well and disappear gracefully into somebody else's title. But Wendy wanted the stage. So she chose a new identity. She adopted the name Wendy Barrie, borrowing from her godfather J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan. There's a bitter little irony in that, ain't there? She took the name of the man who wrote about a boy who refused to grow up, just as she stepped into an industry that was gonna force her to grow up real damn fast. Her breakthrough came in 1933 with The Private Life of Henry VIII. She played Jane Seymour opposite Charles Lawton, and the picture hit big. Internationally big. Suddenly, Wendy Barrie wasn't just another actress. She was a commodity with pedigree. And that was the part Hollywood loved most. They didn't just want her talent. They wanted what she represented. During the Great Depression, American audiences were hungry for fantasy. People were broke, busted, exhausted. They wanted to sit in dark movie houses and stare at glamour. They wanted silk, diamonds, manners, distance from their own misery. Wendy Barrie gave them all of it. When she arrived in America, it wasn't as some dusty hopeful getting off a bus with a suitcase and blind ambition. She arrived on a luxury liner, met by publicists and cameras, wrapped from day one in the illusion of prestige. But like so much in Hollywood, the luxury was a con. Because the studio contract waiting for her wasn't freedom. It was ownership. In the 1930s, those contracts were damn near indentured servitude. The studio owned your schedule, your appearance, your public image, your relationships, your sleep, your diet, your future. They told you what to wear, who to date, where to go, what to say, and when to smile. Wendy may have believed she came to America as an artist. Hollywood saw inventory. The gilded cage. Once the studios got hold of her, they went to work fast. Paramount, RKO. The machine kept feeding her into film after film, shaping her into the polished English aristocrat American audiences couldn't get enough of. She worked insane hours under hot lights, lived under relentless scrutiny, and was photographed endlessly in gardens, at polo grounds, at parties, always elegant, always composed, always marketable. That was the trick. Hollywood didn't just make stars, it manufactured illusions and sold them as truth. Wendy Barrie became the perfect Depression-era fantasy: silk gowns, old-world manners, champagne society, grace under pressure. But inside that polished shell was a woman increasingly isolated in a brutal, transactional town. Because Hollywood high society was never warm, it was calculated. Everybody smiling at you was measuring your value. If you made money, you were treasured. If you stopped making money, you became wallpaper. Wendy moved through rooms with Hearst, Chaplin, Gable, Cary Grant. She attended the right parties, said the right things, hit the right marks. But all that elegance was performance. Behind the polish, she was alone. And that loneliness mattered. Because by marketing her as distant, refined, and untouchable, the studios didn't protect her. They marked her. To men from the underworld, money was common. Violence was common. Tailored suits, mistresses, big cars, common. Respect, that was the rare stuff. Respect couldn't be stolen at gunpoint. It had to be absorbed, borrowed, worn. And to a gangster clawing his way into elite society, Wendy Barrie was the ultimate prize. She wasn't a chorus girl. She wasn't a desperate starlet. She was class. She was status. She was what he could never truly become on his own. That made her valuable and dangerous. Bugsy wants in. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel came out of Brooklyn violence. He was a founding syndicate figure tied to Murder, Inc., built on extortion, enforcement, and the steady accumulation of fear. He wasn't a fantasy. He wasn't a misunderstood anti-hero. He was a man who knew how to use terror as leverage. By the time he landed in Los Angeles, he had money, guns, charisma, connections. But one thing still ate at him like acid. The elites didn't respect him. They feared him, sure, but fear ain't the same as being accepted. The studio bosses, the old money crowd, the polished socialites, they looked at him like he was exactly what he was, a dangerous street animal in an expensive suit. Bugsy felt that, and because he felt it, he needed a way in. George Raft and other entertainment world figures may have cracked the door between the underworld and Hollywood society, but Bugsy wanted more than a foot in the room. He wanted to walk straight through the front door and make every bastard inside pretend he belonged there. That is where Wendy Barrie became useful. He didn't court her like some love-struck admirer. He annexed her life like hostile territory. He learned the landscape around her, her schedule, the places she went, the men who controlled her contract. And instead of coming at her like a common thug, he did what predators do best. He worked the environment. He made sure the studio bosses understood exactly who he wanted. And once that message landed, everything around Wendy started shifting. Because Hollywood liked to act powerful, but when the mob leaned in close, the moguls turned yellow. Hollywood makes its deal. Here's the ugly part. The studios didn't just fail Wendy Barrie. They were already in business with the world that trapped her. During the Depression, the movie industry was under enormous financial strain. Labor pressure was rising. Strikes were a threat. Distribution could be disrupted. Theaters could be targeted. The moguls who projected absolute power in public were cutting deals in private, paying off mob-linked interests and appeasing men they were too scared to fight. That's the dirty secret. The glamorous dream factory was terrified. So when Bugsy Siegel fixed his attention on Wendy Barrie, the men who should have protected her did what cowards always do when profit is on the table. They looked the other way. Maybe no paper was signed. Maybe nobody formally said, "Here, take her." That ain't how these things work. Real corruption is quieter than that. It operates through silence, through inaction, through convenient blindness. And Wendy, raised to respect systems, authority, hierarchy, and rules, didn't yet understand that the system itself had already sold her out. She believed her value to the studio meant safety. Instead, her value made her currency. Beautiful, classy, dependent, obedient, publicly recognizable, socially useful. She was the perfect offering. Human shield. What Bugsy did next wasn't romance. It was strategic possession. He smothered her with proximity. He appeared on sets, loomed near cameras, inserted himself into the social architecture of her world. And suddenly, the whole industry got the message. Wendy Barrie belonged to the syndicate. The shift was immediate. Co-stars grew cautious. Executives stopped treating her like one of their own. Conversations changed when she entered a room. She wasn't merely a star anymore. She was radioactive. Then came the gifts. Diamonds, platinum, imported furs, glittering displays of wealth that looked romantic in photographs, but functioned like chains. In the underworld, gifts ain't gifts. They're claims, debts, markers of possession. Every jewel on her body became a public announcement. She's his. Their outings were orchestrated with terrifying precision. The Trocadero, Cyros, the Brown Derby. Places where power met performance. Places where everybody saw and everybody remembered. When Wendy entered, people turned because she was Wendy Barrie. When Bugsy followed behind her, the whole room changed temperature. That's what she gave him, not companionship, not love, not legitimacy in any honest sense. She gave him forced acceptance. She compelled powerful men to stand up, shake hands, pull out chairs, and smile at a killer because he arrived attached to one of their stars. And Bugsy loved that. He sat at those tables soaking in the theater of false respect, using Wendy's glow to soften his threats. Over drinks and dinner, he could steer the conversation toward labor trouble, union pressure, problems on sets, business disruptions, extortion, all dressed up like social chatter. She sat there beside him, poised and polished, lending elegance to menace. That made her more than his date. It made her tactical equipment. The performance of survival. Wendy Barrie's life became a constant, nerve-shredding performance. She had to be beautiful, calm, and socially perfect in public, while navigating the moods of a paranoid, violent man in private. A wrong glance, an awkward pause, a misplaced word, any of it could set him off. So she adapted. She became a reader of danger, a manager of tempers, a bomb technician working with a psychopath's ego. She learned to anticipate shifts in his expression. She learned when to soften her tone, when to redirect, when to soothe, when to disappear. She was no longer just acting for cameras. She was acting to stay alive. And the world loved the show. The newspapers glamorized it. Gossip columns polished the lie until it shined. Bugsy became a dashing businessman. Wendy became his leading lady. Photos showed cocktails, red carpets, smiles, elegance. What the public saw was a fairy tale. What Wendy lived was captivity. That's the sickness of Hollywood right there. It can take a predator and a prisoner, put a flashbulb in front of them, and sell the result as romance. Bugsy used Wendy the way criminals use shell companies, forged papers, and front businesses. He laundered himself through her image, her accent, her posture, her reputation, her fame. All of it made him appear more acceptable, more integrated, more untouchable. And the industry let it happen because everybody was getting something out of it. The press got headlines. The studios got breathing room. The gangsters got access. And Wendy got stripped for parts. The usefulness of a star. Wendy's value to Bugsy wasn't just social. It was operational. Los Angeles law enforcement, like so many institutions in that era, was deeply compromised. Corrupt where it counted, cautious when it came to celebrities. The movie industry carried political weight, and top stars moved through the city with a kind of localized immunity. Bugsy understood that fast. A gangster driving alone through Beverly Hills might get stopped. A known syndicate man might get searched. Guns might be found, records might surface, trouble might begin. But put Wendy Barrie in the passenger seat, and suddenly the whole equation changes. Now the patrolman sees a beloved actress, tips his hat, and waves the car through. That's power. Not the flashy kind, the real kind. The kind that moves contraband, secures meetings, lowers suspicion, and discourages scrutiny. Bugsy didn't just date Wendy Barrie. He used her like legal armor. Her presence normalized the abnormal. It made illicit movement look social. It made mob business look glamorous. It made criminal access look like celebrity privilege. And for Wendy, that was another layer of hell. She understood enough to know what she was part of, but not enough to escape it cleanly. She sat through dinners full of veiled threats, payoff arrangements, labor pressure, and quiet extortion disguised as civilized conversation. Her silence became another prison wall. And every time the camera flashed, another brick got laid. Expiration date. The thing about being useful to a man like Bugsy Siegel is simple. Usefulness runs out. That realization came to Wendy not in some dramatic showdown, but in the awful cold logic of criminal reality. She began to understand that Bugsy didn't love her, couldn't love her. Men like that don't form attachments, they form strategies. She was a move on the board. A way into certain rooms. A way past certain guards. A way to make certain men uncomfortable. A way to project class over brutality. But the landscape was changing. Bugsy's heat was rising. Federal attention was growing. Rival syndicate bosses were getting tired of his ego and his spending. And beyond Los Angeles was something bigger, Las Vegas. Nevada meant expansion. The Flamingo meant empire. The next phase of Bugsy's ambition required a different kind of companion. He didn't need a British aristocrat pouring tea. He needed underworld fluency. He needed Virginia Hill. And so, slowly, subtly, insultingly, Wendy felt the shift. Fewer demands, fewer calls, fewer appearances, fewer instructions. At first, it may have looked like relief. But anybody who understands predatory men knows that being released by one doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like waiting to see whether the final move is abandonment or elimination. Because Wendy knew too much. She had seen meetings, heard names, understood patterns. She knew enough to be dangerous, at least on paper. And in the mob, loose ends don't usually retire peacefully. So she stood in the expensive house, looked at the gowns, the jewelry, the trappings of luxury, and understood the truth. None of it was hers. It was the costume of captivity, thrown away. Bugsy didn't end the relationship with tears or drama. He detached. That's it. Cold, mechanical, indifferent. The calls stopped. The pressure eased. The suffocating presence faded. And for one brief moment, Wendy may have thought she'd survived the worst of it. But she was about to find out something uglier than mob possession. Hollywood betrayal. Because once the federal government started taking a harder look at syndicate infiltration, the studio bosses did what cowards in power always do. They sanitized themselves. They needed distance from scandal, needed clean hands, needed a fresh public image. And who better to sacrifice than the woman they had already failed once? Wendy went back expecting work. Instead, the temperature dropped to 0. Agents stopped calling. Scripts stopped arriving. Executives stopped meeting her eyes. Contracts were allowed to expire. Premium roles dried up. Better projects vanished. She wasn't formally blacklisted with some big dramatic declaration. Nah, it was worse than that. She was frozen out. Quietly, collectively, efficiently. The same machine that had tolerated her relationship with Bugsy when it was convenient now used that same relationship to bury her. They recast her from victim into liability, from star into stain. And socially, forget about it. The parties stopped. The invitations vanished. The old smiles curdled into judgment. Co-stars turned away in public. Directors crossed streets. The social execution followed the professional one like clockwork. Then came the columnists. Hollywood's gossip queens tied tight to studio interests helped finish the job. Blind items, hints, smears, character assassinations. The elegant British rose was rebranded as damaged goods, tainted by the underworld. That's the part that really stinks, see? The mob never pretended to be moral. The studios did. The gangsters were monsters in plain view. The executives were monsters with cufflinks. Rebuilding in exile. But Wendy Barrie didn't disappear. And that matters. Because lesser people would have collapsed. A lot of people would have gone to pieces after being used by the mob, abandoned by the studios, and socially buried by the same industry that made them famous. Wendy didn't. She left. She turned her back on Los Angeles and headed east to New York, where a new, unproven medium was beginning to claw its way into American life: television. At the time, film elites looked down on TV. They saw it as cheap, low-rent, second class, a dumping ground for washed-up actors and desperate performers. For a former film star, making that jump was supposed to look like defeat. Wendy treated it like survival. And survival, my friend, is its own kind of victory. She adapted. She worked. She hosted. She sold. She learned. She became a pioneer in early broadcasting, including The Wendy Barrie Show, using the same warmth, timing, intelligence, and polish that had once lit up the silver screen. The giant sound stages were gone. The fantasy of movie royalty was gone. But Wendy was still there. That's the piece people miss. They tried to destroy her public identity. They tried to reduce her to scandal. They tried to make her fade. She refused. Not with screaming. Not with spectacle. Not with some desperate public collapse. She just kept going. That kind of dignity scares corrupt systems more than outrage ever does. Bugsy dies, the stain remains. On June 20th, 1947, Bugsy Siegel was shot dead in Beverly Hills. A sniper with an M1 carbine tore through a window and obliterated the illusion of invincibility in a matter of seconds. The man who had terrorized, extorted, manipulated, and strutted through Hollywood as if he owned it, died the way so many men like him do, suddenly, violently, and without dignity. For Wendy, the news must have landed with a complicated force. Not joy. Not grief. Something colder than both. Relief, maybe, but relief with scars on it. Because Bugsy's death ended the man. It did not end what he had done to her. That's the cruel joke. The gangster can die in a spray of bullets and still live on as legend, while the woman attached to his name keeps paying the bill. The press dredged up the old photos again, the old headlines, the old association. Even in death, he continued to contaminate her public image. And Hollywood, that shameless son of a bitch of an industry, learned exactly the wrong lesson. Instead of confronting its complicity, it romanticized men like Bugsy. It monetized the mythology. It turned gangsters into anti-heroes, made prestige entertainment out of killers, and sold the public another polished lie. The murderer became cinema. The woman who survived him stayed exiled. That tells you everything you need to know about the moral spine of the machine. The ghost they couldn't erase. Wendy Barrie kept working through television into the 1950s and early 1960s. She remained a familiar face to viewers who may have had no idea what she had survived. She did not turn herself into a public spectacle. She did not chase revenge through tabloids. She did not write some lurid tell-all to beg the same industry for attention. She rebuilt. Eventually, she married textile executive David L. Meyer and found a measure of peace far from the poison center of old Hollywood. The camera lights dimmed. The world moved on. She aged not as a scandal, but as a survivor. She died on February 2nd, 1978, in Englewood, New Jersey, at the age of 65. And even then, the old branding clung to her. That's how deep the corruption ran. Even after everything, even after all the rebuilding, even after all the years, the machine still wanted her name tethered to the gangster. But that ain't her real legacy. Her legacy is not in the scandal columns, not in the whispers, not in the cheap mythology, not in Bugsy's shadow. Her legacy is survival. Wendy Barrie stands as a haunting indictment of Hollywood's golden age, an era that loved beauty, sold fantasy, worshipped profit, and abandoned people the second they became inconvenient. She was used by power, discarded by power, and she still did not surrender her dignity. That's bigger than stardom. That's character. Hollywood always wants you to remember the glow and forget the cost. It wants you to remember the gowns, the premieres, the cocktails, the famous names, the polished smiles. It wants you to believe the golden age was all class and elegance and magic. But when you look closer, the whole damn thing starts to crack. And in those cracks, you find people like Wendy Barrie, a woman sold to the public as refinement, used privately as protection, abandoned when the heat came down, then punished for surviving. That is the real story, not the myth of the glamorous gangster. Not the fantasy of the untouchable star, but the machinery in between, the studios, the cowards, the fixers, the men who made deals in private and let women carry the consequences in public. Wendy Barrie was not just caught in a scandal. She was trapped in a system. And that system was built to protect power, not people. So when we talk about old Hollywood, let's stop talking like it was some sacred kingdom of beauty ruined by a few bad men. The rot was in the walls. The corruption was part of the architecture. And women like Wendy weren't merely casualties. They were the price of doing business. This has been Wendy Barrie, Hollywood, Bugsy, and the Price of Glamour. A Pizzaverse Studios documentary. A Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. If you like documentaries that go past the surface, past the bullshit, and straight into the blood underneath the glamour, make sure you're locked in with the Pizzaverse. Because around here, we don't just tell stories. We dig up what they tried to bury. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. And thank you for keeping the Pizzaverse alive. Stick around for more deep dives into the hidden rot behind fame, power, crime, and corruption. Because the truth ain't always pretty, but it matters. And in this house, we tell it anyway. Wendy Barrie. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel.